this one. So
Does that mean it started?
keep you guys.
Yep, it's running.
Okay, perfect.
So do I need to, so,
Stop it if I'm not
Just
back
gonna go ahead
at the
and
end.
start.
Sorry.
Okay, cool. So thank you for coming to just learn more about autism and maybe how to create more supportive environments for kids affected by autism. So my name is Aaron Hortz. I'm one of the clinical directors at Arizona Autism United. I've been working with kids, families, schools affected by autism for more than 15 years, and some of that time has been working as a teacher in schools, so I understand what it is like to run classrooms with students with autism. And I've spent a lot of time working with schools, helping develop classrooms and programs, and hopefully some of the stuff we talk about today is useful and motivational to you guys as we go forward. I do encourage, whenever I do these types of talks, or any type of talk, that ask questions. Discussion points, what about this, what about that? I find that is a great way to keep these things lively, to help customize any given stand and deliver to the crowd in front of me. So I encourage that type of back and forth. If you have questions or whatever as we go along, let me know. I like discussion. All right. So let's start. Start at the beginning. What is autism? This is tough because this is the same talk back to back. So I just did this. I'm like, all right, I'll get momentum. Yeah. All right. Okay, so what is autism? Autism is a neurobiological disorder of unknown origin. This is tremendously unsatisfying to people affected by autism, to families affected by autism, to people who research autism. It is what it is. Most current state of the science is that there is some sort of genetic predisposition, some sort of genetic vulnerability to autism that is then sort of manifested or brought to bear by some, again, as yet unknown, as yet unspecified environmental antagonist. So there's a genetic vulnerability in an unknown environmental antagonist. Not very satisfying, right? It just, we know that there's a genetic component because autism tends to run in families. You tend to see more siblings. If one sibling has a diagnosis of autism, you're very likely to see other siblings. It also tends to run in the same lines as other mental health concerns such as schizophrenia or bipolarity. Parental age, increased risk is associated as mom and dad get older. Risk of having autism increases by upwards of threefold. And if anybody's wondering, there is no risks associated or causal links associated with vaccinations. That has been borne out in study after study after study. So that's not a thing. What's that?
How do you know that's not the environmental antagonist? I'm curious.
Oh, I got a whole slide on that. Not a whole slide, at least a bullet point though. Yeah. Well, the honest answer is though, because it got so much attention that the entire scientific community, or a large portion of the scientific community, went and looked at that specifically as the antagonist, and had pretty unequivocally ruled it out. So autism presents in many, many different ways. So if you've met a kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism. That said, autism by definition affects communication. It affects repetitive, stereotype patterns of behavior and it affects social skills. There are different ways to talk about this or account for this. One way that might be helpful as we go through today's talk is to talk about it from a cognitive perspective. And maybe this is comfort food for educators, but most of us process the world and process information from what cognitive scientists call a linguistic platform for processing information. This allows us to be good at using symbolic language and metaphor, which contributes to general flexibility, prediction, anticipation, perspective taking, that type of thing. It affects how we store information and how we act on information. Individuals with autism process information from what they call a visual platform of information processing, which affords, in some cases, great attention to detail. It gives rise to abilities that are astonishing, and I'll talk a little bit about those later, but things that tend to be require great detail, memory, and tend to be black and white. Now, this also makes certain things challenging, specifically social skills, perspective taking, anticipation, prediction, these kind of things. When you approach the world and approach information and process information in these two different ways, when you have limitations that are in the areas of being able to metaphor and relate unknown experiences to known experiences, this contributes to greater levels of anxiety, which we see come out in different parts of the behavioral profile of kids with autism. As it stands, 1 in 59 children in America by the age of 8 are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. 1 in 59. That's a lot. That's a lot. State of Arizona, 1 in 71 kids are diagnosed with autism, so I attribute those lower statistics to the fact that outside of Maricopa County, access to health care diminishes pretty significantly. So we have less diagnosis. Although from 1997 to 2008, we've seen autism prevalence increased by almost 300%. The suspected antagonist in the vaccines was taken out in 2001, and yet we see those continue to rise. Yes?
Have they connected anything dietarily?
No, but I will speak to diet too a little bit. No, and if I had more time, I'd do a tangent on that.
Okay.
That's real tempting.
I can stay after class.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's probably lots of other issues, broadly speaking, and that maybe may be related to our current diet relative to the diet of our ancestors and the diet that we've evolved around. But in terms of state of the science, there is no if-then kind of causal relationship between that. Okay, I gotta shake that off. You threw me a rope. Okay, so autism can be diagnosed as early as 18 months. I've seen it diagnosed as early as a year. Usually it has to be pretty apparent to be diagnosed that young. It can be diagnosed with certainty by the age of 2. That has to do with developmental sort of when vocal verbal language starts to appear purposes, the earlier, the better you can get a diagnosis. The earlier you start intervention, the better the outcomes for everybody. The only professionals who can actually make a diagnosis of autism are developmental pediatricians, neurologists, psychologists, and psychiatrists. I throw this out there because it's not uncommon for me to encounter parents or professionals working on behalf of somebody with autism, or caring for somebody with autism, to say, I'm trying to get services, or I'm trying to access some sort of system of care. He's got an autism diagnosis from a social worker, from a nurse, from a school psychologist. Those aren't diagnoses, okay? These are the professionals that can actually give a medical diagnosis of autism. Although that carries different weight in different meetings and different systems of care. As you guys know, a medical diagnosis of autism does not necessarily translate to a category of eligibility of autism in school districts, and vice versa. As it stands, 1 to 2% of the world has an autism spectrum disorder, with over 3.5 million people in the United States. So again, lots of people with autism. Anybody in this room directly affected by autism? About right. All right, so front and center, when we encounter, when we meet, when we interact with somebody with autism, what are the things that we see right off the bat? We see impairments in social skills, by definition, right? This is sort of a diagnostic criteria of autism. We can trace that back again if we want to talk about how we're processing information from the world around us. From that visual processing, that visual platform of processing information. Seeing things from other people's perspective is going to be really difficult, right? And I think we take for granted a lot of times, I know I take for granted a lot of times, and what I expect from other people hinges a lot on the fact that I expect that you can see something from my perspective. You get my wants, okay? So this is very difficult. Not that it cannot be taught, it is very difficult for kids affected by autism. Challenging behavior, again, not to paint with too broad a brush, but having difficulty anticipating the world, understanding the expectations, the unwritten rules of the world around us, makes for often a backdrop of I don't understand, or a backdrop of anxiety, quicker fight or flight. So therein, challenging behavior. We also see challenging behavior related to some of the other things I'm going to talk about on some other slides. But whenever we're talking about challenging behavior, moreover talking about intervening or treating challenging behavior, I think it's really, really important that we come at it from a perspective, we come at it with perspective that we need to teach. And we can do that. In intervention plans, good intervention plans should revolve on what are the skills that we need to teach. Also associated with autism, front and center, delayed, limited, absent communication. So again, this is part of the diagnostic criteria. Adaptive skill acquisition, so activities of daily living can often be delayed. Difficulty transitioning, again, you might relate this back to this sort of processing difference. Not surprisingly, difficulty with figurative, ambiguous leading language, and poor coordination. Oftentimes we see this manifest more in poor fine motor and oral motor coordination than gross motor coordination, although that can be a thing too. That can be a thing with anybody. So things to be aware of, and maybe things in the service of creating more supportive environments or informing our teaching strategies that we want to be aware of. So if these are the things that are front and center, some of the things that might not always be front and center that I think are important to our calculus in helping, supporting, befriending kids with autism. What is often going on behind the scenes? Sleep issues. Sleep issues in my work are one of the major stressors of families affected by autism. Kids with autism often have dysregulated sleep patterns up in the middle of the night, maybe just up doing nothing. Maybe they're up doing inventory on things in the house, or pacing, or eating, or reading, or whatever. But the sleep pattern, you know, if you look at normal sleep patterns, they've got a nice kind of arc to them. The autism sleep pattern is often all over the place, and that can be traced right back to structurally how the neurology is put together. Those of you with direct connections to autism, do those families have, do they talk about sleep issues in their kids? No? Cool. That's fortunate.
On like a practical level,
Yeah.
how would you, I don't know if you're gonna address it earlier,
Yeah.
but if you're dealing with a kid who comes into your classroom who clearly has dysregular sleep
Mm-hmm.
for whatever reasons, tie it back to their autism diagnosis,
Sure.
how would you practically address that in a classroom setting?
I don't know that you do practically address it in a classroom setting.
Because it's
Okay.
so impactful, and that's
Mhm.
one of my students is struggling with that right now,
Mhm.
and there's not like a practical solution to it.
You know,
I
my
don't
first
know.
came here, they encouraged me to let my child sleep in the corner in a beanbag.
Yeah.
If that's what that child
Really?
needed. Give them what they need first, and then teach them. I don't know if you could comfortably do that yet in
Oh, well,
school.
that's
What do
what's-
you think that would look like in high school, Kristen?
I would say probably, maybe not in the classroom, but in the front office, we can make that
Front
work
office?
for that student, especially if it's first hour of the day where they're coming in.
They're crashing and you
Because
can
I
get them
know-
somewhere comfortable to sleep.
Because I know it's just
And it mean, yeah, I know
consistent.
Mr. Freeman has brought that up to my attention with another student, so we might be talking about the same kiddo too. Mhm.
Yeah,
I
there's,
like that solution, if
Yeah.
you can give them a space
Mhm.
to rest,
Because we
because then
have-
they're just amazing when they're resting.
We have a
Sure.
bed in there, so that could be a beautiful thing.
I think that response is probably the most immediately compassionate response, right? You're not gonna get any sort of learning out of a
Right.
kid who's falling asleep and
Right.
trying to fight that. It's
He's
gonna be,
cognitively great to have, so his sleeping is
What
my
he needs to do right now.
biggest thing, yeah, so I just, like, practically is that what that looks like.
now the flip side of that is, I think that's probably a good short-term,
Right.
like,
Right.
that's what we can do. What I would do beyond that is say we need to work with a broader team and hopefully get somebody who's also working with the family in the evening times, and let's get a sleep intervention together, which there are many sleep interventions. Some of them involve pharmacology, some of them are very behavioral, but there's lots of different things to do. But in doing that, there's gonna be some things that are gonna be a pain in the butt on the school end, once you start doing that. Because my bet is gonna be, it doesn't involve letting them sleep during the day,
Right.
right? You know, cause if you're sleeping during the day, you're damn sure not gonna sleep at night.
And then the family is reliant that we're just gonna.
You get into that schedule, and then
Right.
you get into that routine, and
Correct.
so sometimes our sleep interventions, on the more extreme end,
Right,
involve keeping people up around the clock to reset their, reset their circadian rhythm. Because it's real easy to get into these, you know, these wonky sleep patterns. But there's all types of, you know, different sort of incentive or reward systems you can do.
And are those patterns universal depending on like age-wise, or do you see it being more prevalent in certain age groups than another?
No, I think I probably a good theme for this is gonna be, let's not think of anything as universal, but maybe higher likelihoods in population. Very few things in autism are universal. In terms of, there are some things that kids can grow out of, right? Sometimes sleep issues are that, sometimes bedwetting's that, sometimes, you know, potty training is just super late to take hold.
Like puberty,
yeah.
like, so, because I teach in middle school, is that
Yeah.
something that might, like, be an onset or be a factor that impacts that?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and that could be, you know, they didn't have sleep issues before, now they're going through puberty, and now we've got all types of sleep, and as a former middle school teacher, all types of other new and cool behavior. The benefit of working in the schools versus at home is you can be like, that is for at home with doors closed. Let's work with mom and dad on how to do that. And I, you know, and here's the thing too. I'm not going to get too far into this. This is a little off topic, but I will say, for talking to high school and middle school teachers, with kids who are quote unquote highly functioning to kids who have a lot of impairments, starting to talk about and address like puberty and sex stuff is super duper important. And there are, again, I don't want to get into this in this talk, but like, if those things, understanding that there are limitations around social skills, social boundaries, right? We want to start teaching how, when, where to do those things, when it's acceptable, where it's appropriate, in some cases how to. Because people get hurt. Sometimes people hurt themselves, and sometimes people hurt other people. So it's, you know, those conversations should happen. And honestly, because they are developmentally delayed, or maybe they are intellectually delayed, the rest of them is not delayed. And so I don't think those conversations should be had when they're like, you know, developmentally ready to have the talk, physically ready to have the talk. So sleep is an issue, diet and feeding is an issue. Feeding is often a common intervention because we have oral motor issues, chewing and swallowing is a problem, so sometimes we'll target that. This sort of visual processing contributes to, I'm just going to kind of like string a bunch of words together since we don't have like all day to do this, but this type of processing information contributes to difficulty transitioning and a greater appreciation, need for sameness, right? So a lot of what we see in diet, we see really restricted diets.
My grandson only eats things that are white.
Yes.
That's a strange thing, but
Yeah.
it's very neutral to him, and the other colors are too exciting. He doesn't want to see them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like,
Noodles, cottage cheese, anything that has to do with color.
and if anything of other colors invades, his response to that is probably not subtle. Yeah.
Covers his eyes.
Mhm.
You know I don't eat that. He talks in the third person. Luke doesn't eat
Mhm.
that. He's pretty good.
That's interesting. That's cool, but and that's not uncommon. It could be color, it could be texture, it could be brand. You know, there are all types of things, and they tend to get more restricted over time. We do lots of interventions that involve exposure to mixing things up. And we do them systematically, and we do them compassionately, but that type of rigidity tends to get harder and harder to alter over time. Now there is also a sort of like, pick your battles, and also there's like a bunch of food that I don't like eating too. So like, where do you draw the line on that? But overall, inflexibility and rigidity, you know, those are something to consider if they're worth diving into, and the only way to intervene on that type of stuff is head on. Okay, diet and feeding. Family stress, obviously these things contribute to a greater backdrop of overall family stress between parents, among the whole family unit. Understand these as a backdrop also for other behavior challenges that might arise. Allergies, we see allergies at higher incidence. So whether those be food allergies or environmental allergies, these tend to come higher incidence in kids with autism than the rest of the population. Same with seizures, gastrointestinal issues. You know, this is a little bit of a chicken and the egg too, because knowing that diet and feeding are an issue, GI is an issue, so it's hard to know, like, did some food, was that associated with a GI issue and now I don't want that, or because I have a fairly restricted diet, do I have trouble with GI issues? Are they not related at all? Kind of hard to say, but it is very common for kids on the autism spectrum to have like real constipation issues, or the flip side, lots of diarrhea issues. In some cases, just not pulling out all the nutrition from food, etc. Again, you might see how these can contribute to other medical and behavioral issues. So one of the things that came up in the last talk had to do with, somebody asked me about, sleep issues. They asked me about like, oh, well, you know, we've got a parent who thinks that the sleep issues are related to sleep apnea, and is that, you know, could it be that? I said, I don't know, you know, but that's an easy thing to rule out. So, as a behavior analyst, as a dude who does like behavioral treatment and behavior intervention like all day, I will say it's, before we embark on behavioral interventions, try to rule out any medical stuff, right? Don't embark on a feeding intervention or potty training if you can rule out, you know, medical or dietary issues. Don't embark on a sleep treatment if, you know, before you've ruled out any sort of underlying medical issue. It's a lot easier to treat a medical problem than it is to treat it behaviorally. You can do it, but it's just a lot more work. And I will say, for families that are already stressed, these interventions, these sleep interventions, feeding interventions, potty training interventions, they take a lot of work. They're a lot of work, and they're really stressful. So the parsimonious approach is always, if there's a medical solution that we can rule out and treat at that level, let's do that before we start to do a behavioral intervention. Probably the most commonly known backdrop issue associated with autism is sensory sensitivities, sensory insensitivities. Understanding that the neurological structure is somewhat different for individuals affected by autism. They experience physical sensation differently. Some of it, you may have known kids who have a really high tolerance for otherwise what I would think of as like aversive stimulation. Maybe that's cold water, maybe it's motion round and round, maybe it's different textures. I've known kids who outwardly don't have, like, you might not know that they have autism, but they engage in pica, so they eat, you know, they ingest non-foods, rocks and other big things. Just don't experience that in the same sensory way that I might. Similarly, you might see kids who have low tolerance, low threshold for the sound of an air conditioner or a fire alarm. You know, I thought I'd get more like, oh yeah, fire alarms. For, like, you know, when I was a teacher, well, one of the things I did, I got in really big trouble for doing this, but I disconnected the intercom because every time the intercom would, it just set my whole room sideways. And somebody would come down and be like, they've been paging you for now. Sensitivities, you know, sometimes conversational level, like I said, fire drills could, like, those can stick with the kid for a long time. So I'm gonna soapbox on this just for another minute, because in a lot of schools that I go into, people are fairly aware of like the ideas of autism and sensory are kind of paired together, right? Okay, that's fine. And I think kids with autism do have different sensory needs. Just like kids with ADHD have different sensory needs, right? Or any of us have different, like as I'm doing a talk, I've got a fidget in my pocket, right? And I've got different, I get it, is what I'm saying. But I want to caution people from going down a sensory integration kind of rabbit hole, because while I think it is entirely appropriate to use sensory activities to get ahead of challenging behavior that might be a function of I don't have enough input or I have too much input, I think that's fine. Schedule those things in proactively, whether it's access to sensory rooms or certain activities or whatever. Don't do those things in response to, oh, he's having a really challenging behavior, he's having a tantrum, he must have a sensory need. Let's all come to the rescue with like sensory activities, or send him out of the classroom to go to a sensory room. I think reacting to challenging behavior with sensory solutions probably is going to effectively, very effectively teach this is how you get sensory stuff, right?
It's a reward,
Yeah, for sure, right? Like, oh, like that's, don't blame the learner for that, right? So also, so use sensory activities just like you would use any other activity, right? You want sensory activities? Great. Do this, this, and this, then sensory time. Or we're going to do it at the beginning of, we're going to get your wiggles out or whatever at the beginning of every class. That's great. That's awesome. Don't expect that these type of activities, that like looking at glow tubes with bubbles in them or flashing lights or those things are going to magically integrate senses, okay? That's kind of, that, I don't want to offend anybody, but there is no science to sensory integration. That data doesn't exist, okay? There are sensory needs. I appreciate them. I have sensory needs. I've got 2 little boys with ADHD. They have sensory needs. I sort of engineer their environment and my environment accordingly, right? I get it. But I'm also cautious in my life, in my work, that if I present those types of activities in reaction to problem behavior, I'm teaching somebody how to ask for that, okay? So that's my sensory talk. Okay, so while I think it's important to kind of have a balance of, while we see, kids with autism, while we are seeing increased incidence, they do still have to operate in our world, right? And so we are more prone to see the abnormalities and the challenges associated with that type of information processing. But I think it's also important to talk about the interesting strengths and really sort of fascinating and profound skill areas that this type of processing gives rise to. I also think it's important to talk about or be aware of, and this is, so I said this in the last talk too, I don't want to like Rain Man-ify autism, right? And I don't want to like every person with autism, not every person with autism, anything. But there is things you do see that is associated with this type of thinking that has blown my mind. And there are career paths and there are academic paths that play to the strengths of kids with autism. And I think in the service of building supportive environments and career paths and helping people live lives well, I think it's fair to play to their strong suit and play to their forehand in kind of being aware that some things are going to tend to be easier for kids with autism and some things tend to be harder with kids with autism. So some of the gifts associated with visual thinking is an incredible attention to detail. This this fella right here, if you wanna check out either just cool art or just have a YouTube field day, Stephen Wiltshire is an artist with autism who struggles a lot socially, and you can see in 5 seconds of an interview with this guy, he struggles on an interpersonal level, but he can look at a city from the top of a skyscraper or a helicopter or something for 30 minutes and draw it like identically. And there are lots of people out there that have these types of abilities, and this is a product of this type of information processing. So attention to detail, art, math, engineering, and computer sciences, things that tend to be black and white, that require an incredible attention to visual detail. So memory, early decoding tends to be a thing. There tends to also be a large distance between one's ability to decode text and one's ability to pull meaning from text. Also music, both music generation and replication of works of music in great detail. These are all associated with this type of thinking. So yeah, I think playing to people's strong suits is important, and it's important to understand that all of these things, just like anything else with humanity at large, it's a spectrum, it's a continuum, and autism affects different people differently. Identical twins, right? I've worked with a number of identical and fraternal twins, both diagnosed with autism, and one is much more affected than the other, or one is much more academically strong, but maybe has a lot of social skill trouble. Maybe the other one has like fewer behavioral challenges, but I don't know, is gifted in other areas. The point is, an individual with autism who might have difficulty with vocal verbal communication may be otherwise really strong academically, or somebody who may be very weak academically might not need a whole lot of support when it comes to behavior or life skills. And the point of this is that, as educators and just people, I guess, we should not necessarily generalize a skill ability based on performance in one area. Don't generalize across all areas based on performance in one area. Some people will need a little bit of help throughout their life. Some people will need a lot of help throughout their life. It all just kind of depends. Autism shows up differently for everybody. I'll show a quick video that has always resonated with me. Maybe it'll speak to you. I think it's great for perspective.
Autism is really hard to explain for me because I never really experienced being a normal person, because I did that in quotes because, well, let's face it here, there really is no such thing as normal. It can be a lot of different things. It's a spectrum. Not everyone has every single symptom.
You can tell from someone's face if they have autism.
Autism is how someone's brain is wired. It's just part of your perception of the world.
standing around talking, too much noises. Just feels like uncomfortable.
It's lights and sounds that usually do it for me. Like, it's like the entire world is like pressuring you and like crunching onto you, and there's not really much you can do about it except just get out of there.
I don't go to movie theaters. I've never been to a concert. I feel like I'm missing out on a lot of stuff.
I remember very early on, like watching someone scratching at the carpet, like the feeling sticks when it's really awful, and it's just like.
Some people with autism have a hard time knowing when someone's happy or sad or angry or frustrated.
I wish socializing were easier, definitely. Because there are so many times when I'm with other people who seem to have a natural flow of conversation that they all get, and it almost seems like they have a psychic link with each other at some point that I am locked out of.
If someone with autism is like a quiet kid in a corner or something like that, it's usually because he's questioning himself. So if you see someone like sitting alone or something like that, feel free to go and talk to him. It can help them out a ton. Trust me, I know.
Autistic people don't want to be talked down to, first of all.
Well, some people, like teachers and stuff, misunderstand. Because they don't know that people have autism.
I wish people would understand that autistic people have their own voices. I wish people wouldn't judge people with autism so harshly.
I want to know which person knows where autism comes from.
Autism is a complicated subject.
So in order to cure autism, you would have to go into DNA and genetics of someone and alter it. But that's your basic makeup, so that would probably impact your entire being.
I think if you're autistic, and really the only true cure, I think, is really what I have gotten over the years, which is support and love.
If I could cure autism, I would definitely not. Mainly because of the fact that I want people to be different.
I wouldn't want to cure autism now.
I'm really good at a lot of things.
I'm good at thinking a lot.
Good at writing stories, like the beginning and endings. I'm just not very good at filling them in.
I'm good at,
I'm told I have a pretty good sense of humor. I'd like to think I have a good sense of humor.
I went to music school for 6 years in local performance. I was a 3D animation major for 3 years.
I'm good at
Creative writing, fiction, and medieval fantasy.
fishing, taking a walk, riding my bicycle, playing the piano, taking the train, reading, dancing, well, that's all I have.
A lot of people with autism are able to do something.
I would like to live independently. I've always wanted to be a writer.
I also want to make the world a better place.
I don't just see one future, I see many possibilities for my future.
People with autism are people, too. That about sums it up.
I dig that video. second time I've seen it in 2 hours, I see. And I think a big takeaway for me, in addition to perspective taking, is kids with autism want to belong too. And I think as leaders and classroom and school influencers, we're in a position to influence the culture that is created in service of creating that for all students. So some things you can do specific to autism. And it may seem odd given the idea of increasing belonging that I'm going to lead with, be consistent with the behavior plan. So individualized behavior plans done well should be designed to teach important skills that result in the individual learning to access more environments, access long-term reinforcement, to acquire skills to be more included. And a good behavior plan is only as consistent as its implementation. So if you are working with children who have behavior plans, students who have behavior plans, it is important that everybody know what that behavior plan is, and everybody implement it to the best of their ability, get trained to do it, because that's how we teach. If problem behavior continues, is allowed to continue to interfere, the result is more and more, less access to more spaces over time, and less opportunities. So understanding and being consistent with behavior plans is super duper important. Coordinating with the team to learn to best support the plan. Generally speaking, again, kind of getting back to the idea that it can be difficult for students with autism to anticipate when they might get to do the things that they want, when things that they don't want to do are going to be over, how many things do I have to do before I get out of school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Visual schedules and checklists can be tremendously important. They can be super duper useful and low effort, and a great way to get ahead of challenging behavior, make life a little bit easier for everybody. The more you can have homework expectations and clear sort of expectations provided not only to the student but the family and any at-home support services ahead of time, the better, the more the better positioned everybody's going to be to help the kid be academically successful. Positively stating instructions. So one of the things that we do to right off the bat, whenever we're doing teacher training or parent training, etc., is we lead with helping people reframe how they're delivering information to kids. Most people, whenever they see something they would like to see less of, your knee-jerk reaction is to say, knock it off, don't do that, stop doing that, da-da-da-da-da, right? There are two effects of that. One, it doesn't deliver a whole lot of information. Two, giving instructions like that, especially with respect to challenging behavior, you tend to see more of that problem behavior, right? So one of the things, whether you're talking about school rules or whether you're talking about direct instruction, try to frame those positively. The challenge we always give to people is try to get through a classroom period or get through a class period without using the words no, stop, or don't. That is a challenge to you. All right, I know I'm coming up against time, so I'm going to zip through the rest of this. Here's some examples of helpful checklists, organizers, visual schedules, etc. Notice how the rules are stated positively. All right, consider also allowing breaks, using other students to be leaders, to be helpers, organizers. So critical feedback should focus on more on what to do than what not to do. Emphasize practice over lecture. We've worked with lots and lots of people, parents and teachers and whoever alike, who say, I've told him 1,000,000 times, well, but he still does it. core symptom of autism is I have trouble with verbal language, right? I have trouble with communication processing. So role play and practice with repetition, best way to get your message across. Strategic approaches to inclusion. So I think it's important when we're talking about being inclusive and inclusiveness, that this is kind of the general theme of what I'm talking about today. But when you're working on inclusion, this should be done strategically, it should be done with training, people should be prepared. Are we okay?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
so sorry.
We're getting a lot of
I know.
looks.
They had an IEP meeting that they had
Okay.
to go to, so I'm sorry that they had to interrupt you.
Oh, it's okay, I'm fine, I'm just like, I'm kind of reading the room. Okay.
So sorry.
Totally okay. So, while I'm generally speaking, like in terms of building good culture, building good society, I think inclusion across like all diversity is great. I think this makes us better people. I think this makes us better culture. But when we're talking about how to make build positive experiences for individuals with autism and people without autism, how we can increase like the likelihood of them having a positive experience, I think those, like, we need to do it strategically, right? I see inclusion done kind of haphazardly and sloppily a lot of times, that we're just gonna kind of put kids together and like everything's gonna sort of by osmosis work. We need to support and teach in those environments, and teach a lot of social skills and prep ahead of time to get them ready to be successful in those environments. Zip ahead to kind of capitalizing on that, understanding that times like recess or other highly social, unstructured times are like the social Rubicon for kids with autism. And we think like, oh, like PE or you know, recess or things where there's like lots of kids doing things that where everybody kind of gets the unspoken rule of how we sort of organize and do things together as a group. I think those can be really, really challenging environments for kids on the autism spectrum, and in service of making those experiences positive, we want to take them as teaching opportunities and teach to those things. If we can't teach to those things, and I'm speaking specifically now, I think are we talking mostly high school, middle school, high school, or not, doesn't matter? Okay. So recess is kind of one of those things that I'm always like a little bit on the lookout for. When I was in middle school, I always provided my kids alternatives to recess, knowing that unstructured, unsupervised time is going to be really, really not only challenging and anxiety-provoking for them, we're going to have a little bit of re-entry issue coming back to the classroom, but it's also a prime location for bullying and victimization, right? So unstructured, unsupervised time, consider either how we're going to teach and train and support in those environments, or how we're going to maybe provide alternatives to that. Why? So, with an understanding that autism is more and more a part of all of our lives, and in the context of our shared vocation and what we've committed to in terms of building better communities, what kind of environment do we hope to create for all students? What do we want our legacy to be? Is it tolerant? Is it adaptive? Is it accommodating? Is it pro-social? Is it nurturing? And maybe doing some of these things and taking some of those tangible tips and tricks, maybe they're in accordance with some of these values. Moreover, nurturing environments. So while this is a talk organized around autism, there's kind of a bigger picture nurturing environments message I want to leave you guys with, which is doing some of these approaches contribute to overall environments that are associated with larger, meaningful public health outcomes that are not only increase academic success, but are associated with reduced crime, high-risk behavior, long-term physical illness. So nurturing environments are those that minimize coercive behavior, maximize pro-social behavior. They're values directed in that individuals and groups are working together, organized towards a common long-term outcome. And in service or in their movement towards that long-term outcome, they're willing to accept minor discomfort in the service of valued behavior and valued outcomes. So there's a lot of cool public health science on nurturing environments and everything I've talked about today. It kind of fits under that umbrella. Some evidence-based packages available to schools that are also built on or support the development of nurturing environments. These guys, Tootling, PBIS, and good behavior games. Some of these are large scale, some of these are small scale. But they're all based on the same general idea of rewarding pro-social behavior, minimizing punishment, a focus on observable and definable behavior, and recording and monitoring behavior over time. So these are very well-articulated packages ready to launch in any given school, contribute to nurturing environments. Moreover, with or without something like that, I hope we move from here, valuing, if we value healthy students, healthy schools, that we model support, reward tolerance, compassion, inclusiveness, and pro-sociality, minimize opportunity for antisocial behavior, be open to change in service of our values, work towards building nurturing environments, because it's important to you and because it's important to what you want to have done with your time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. I think I'm sure I'm over time, but if anybody has any other questions or follow-up, I'll hang around.